So my talk today, I'm taking you from the deep sea and the great one ocean to the coastal areas, particularly of Southern Africa, but also the Southwest Indian Ocean region, which most of you will probably know if you have traveled to this part of the world, because those islands include the Big Island or the Grande Île of Madagascar, Mauritius, the Seychelles, and Zanzibar, as well as many other islands. And my particular talk is about human relations with the sea, and in particular, the role that the oceans actually play in human health, and how, in fact, that this is a symbiotic system. It's an ecosystem, if you like, in itself, because these things are mutually reinforcing. And just as we heard from Lisa's presentation on the incredible biodiversity that we find in the deep ocean, it is interesting to note that we also have phenomenal cultural diversity on our coasts, and that these play a critical role in securing the future health of our planet. And in the same way that we have perhaps what Lisa and others would term global level extinction happening in the oceans, in the deep oceans, we find that in the coastal areas of the world, we are experiencing what is known as epistemicide, or the extinction, if you like, of global cultural diversity and the epistemologies or knowledge foundations that these can provide. So in my abstract, I indicated that Earth's oceans are under threat from the long-term impacts of climate change and detrimental human activity. I think we are all familiar with this here. And that research in Africa reveals, for those who are interested in fisheries, the collapse of fisheries, and the fact that this is going to lead to human catastrophes of unprecedented proportions. My research on coastal cultural heritage as an anthropologist living in Southern Africa suggests that an area which we have yet to engage with is culture. And we know that in the UN Decade for Ocean Science, that culture is foregrounded as a key element or a key way of actually moving the climate discussion and climate change plans forward. Because this is key to the safeguarding of ocean health and also human health, which is intricately connected to it. A key argument that I will make in my presentation is that in the nearby Southwest Indian Ocean islands, and certainly in Southern Africa, human relations with the sea and coast reveal what is known as what we call a transmaterial, which is that people have these intimate relations or sort of engagements with what may be perceived as non-sentient things. The sea itself is perceived as a living entity, a single organism in many indigenous communities of the world, that these relationships are also what we call embodied, meaning that there are body proximal relations that people have with the sea. We don't have this distant cognitive philosophical engagement with the sea. In Southern Africa and various parts of the indigenous world, we have these very deeply embodied relations with the sea. Third point that is made in the paper, which you can read at your leisure, is the fact that the relationships are often interspecies. So we don't have this Cartesian divide between humans and the ocean, which we are perceiving, I think, quite strongly in some of the global debates that are circulating amongst us today. That these relations are, in fact, interspecies relationships, that people speak about the fact that the fish, for example, in South Africa, they don't just swim from one area to the other in order to find spawning grounds, but that the fish are actually dancing fish, and they run, and they're clever fish. There are some fascinating narratives or stories that are told about human relations with marine biodiversity. And the core part of the discussion, before I launch into all of the different slides, which I'll go through fairly quickly given the time constraints, is that these relationships are producing what I call a form of blue consciousness, which we have not yet tapped into our discussions or plans for climate change. So we're having very high-level discussions around policy, and what inter-state discussions between the G7, etc., what these high-level bodies and discussions can actually achieve for us. But an area which we perhaps are not looking at is this issue of a blue consciousness. Just in the way, I suppose that my colleague here will talk later on about blue foods and nutritions. We have a blue heritage and a blue consciousness, which is very much active in parts of the developing world or low-income countries, as we often like to describe them. A related part to this is that I feel quite strongly that such a blue consciousness can perhaps lead us to consider the notion of blue rights, which are these inalienable rights to the ocean, which we have yet to engage with, and which a lot of local people are articulating in the field research that we are doing. People talk about their fundamental rights to the sea, and yet this is not being taken very seriously. Ultimately, and I suppose as an anthropologist who likes to think in utopian terms, I would like to imagine that this would move us from the social science concept of the Anthropocene, which is this cataclysmic, imminent world in which the oceans will overheat and will have all of the disasters and troubles that Martin has so eloquently discussed in his presentation, to what I hope we could achieve, which is a blue era, which is an era in which there is deeper consciousness of the ocean and engagement with this particular natural asset, not only for scientific endeavor, but also for improving equality across the world. And I think for me, one of the things that came quite strongly in some of the literature that I've been engaging is this quote by Godfrey Baldacchino, who is based at the University of Malta, who writes quite extensively on islands. And he says, words try but simply fail us as we seek to fully describe the manner and the extent to which water and earth, land and sea are imbricated and intertwined in our lives. Water is life and much more. And he speaks quite eloquently about the fact that water unsettles us, the immensity of the ocean expanses belittle us, the wrath of the ocean storms frighten us, and the richness of marine proteins sustain us. So we have these incredibly intertwined and intimate relations with the ocean. But I think one of the things perhaps that is missing from Baldacchino's quote is the fact that people live with water. We don't just, it's life with water, it's not just life underwater. So these are just some of the alignments of the work that I'm doing. We are researching specifically the issue of ocean cultures, which explores community and maritime ocean values and philosophies, what we call ethnographies or field research and praxis, specifically ocean heritage, so not just the common heritage of humankind, which is expressed as being related specifically to the seabed, but the fact of landed and coastal heritages and how these have survived for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Recently, in other words, probably last week, we launched a book called the Palgrave Handbook on Blue Heritage, which consists of the work of 23 authors across the world, some 700 pages on this very issue of blue heritage. What is it? And the earlier parts of the book focus on the evolution of humankind as aquatic hunter-gatherers, that they were there for hundreds of thousands of years, developing this rich and symbiotic relationship with the ocean, and that we seem to have perhaps forgotten about this rich historical heritage, that humans did have beneficial and sustainable relations with the ocean long before this period of industrialization. And here we have an indication of the field research that we've been doing for some time, as well as some of the current research. And just to skip very quickly to my findings, because I'm aware of the time factor here. Give me a moment. So close attention to the context of the anthropological field work that we've done in these areas of Southern Africa and East Africa, allows a perception of alternative grounds for human engagements with the sea. The field research is revealing a richly sensuous and embodied human existence with the sea that is shaped by the tastes and sounds of interaction with the oceans, as well as embodied resistances and effort to communicate the texture of oppression. What do I mean by this? So, for example, one of the things that we observed in our research was how women and men across the world are physically and economically dependent on the sea and lagoons. When we talk about economically, we're talking about livelihoods, but in fact, people do have a physical and embodied relationship with the sea. The lagoons and tidal zones structures daily activity and sociality. Women wake up at dawn to collect specific shellfish from the tidal zones, and at low tides in the afternoon, they set out once more to collect specific shellfish and species for dinner. By contrast, men wake up at dawn and set out to sea to catch fish and lay fish traps, and they return at noon or shortly after with the day's bounty. What these findings basically told us is that these rhythms with the sea actually shape human bodies physically and psychologically. They produce a culture of the sea. Going out to sea or to the tidal zone was not merely about the catch, it was about the feeling of being on water, the buoyancy of the sea, the ruggedness of the waves, the pull of specific currents, and the simultaneity of multi-sensory experience of the ocean, including, I suppose, heat waves on sea, the searing heat of the lagoon when the sun is high, along with the wetness of ankle-deep seawater at low tide and the rising stench of a briny sea. In the Southern African context, we have these researchers that are working with us. As you can see them on the screen there, are perhaps our most recent next generation of researchers. And it is fascinating to encounter the ancestral veneration aspect in the ocean context. So approximately pretty much most of the Southern African communities that we engaged expressed the fact that they believe that there are ancestral spirits that reside on the bed of the sea, and that these particular beliefs pose a huge problem for ocean mining and other extractive engagements with the ocean that could potentially have a detrimental impact on ocean health. What these stories about ancestral veneration with the sea are telling us is the fact that we have many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who have an alternative philosophy of the sea and have a protective engagement with the sea, which as yet these levels of discussions are not featuring in the higher echelons where decisions are being made. Another point that I wish to make is that even in the Southwest Indian Ocean region, we find that many of the communities that we engaged with there over the last 20 years, they not only have these ideas about the sea, about ancestral veneration and ancestors being in the sea, but they also cultivate particular beliefs, interspecies beliefs in relation to specific marine organisms. So engaging with a marlin or going out to sea in order to collect the octopus, which is perceived to be an extraordinarily clever species. There are these very, very rich accounts of how, of particular philosophies of the ocean. So there are the key findings there. They relate specifically to heritages of the sea, that these heritages find expression in leisure activities, in culinary practices, and what I call embodied ritual practices that involve the sea. The sea heritage also heals people. For example, there were many, many accounts, not of indigenous or autochthonous peoples, people that deliberately choose to buy property by the sea because it forms an integral part of their healing process. It has a massive impact on psychological and physical well-being. It decreases depression, provides an alternative space for cultural practice, helps to release long-term trauma. In fact, there are some phenomenal papers on blue care and blue spaces and the role that these could actually play in helping us to define what are natural science, I suppose, concerns around marine protected areas. We tend to think of marine protected areas only as marine biodiversity spaces, but they have a critical role to play in blue care and the psychological health of human populations. And of course, it brings us back to the sensory biological nature of human beings. Because one of the outcomes, unfortunate outcomes, I think, of industrialization and development, as we understand it today, is that development has basically taken us away from our sensory biological selves. We have become largely cognitive beings with philosophies that we expound, but our relationship with nature, our physical sensory relationship with nature, is something that we are not yet taking into account. And I think the UN Decade for Ocean Science provides us with this opportunity to realize and to come back to the sensory selves, which, I mean, I think is a fundamental nature of human beings. Here are some images from the research. These are some of the communities that we've engaged with, people who hold alternative belief systems, healer diviners in the South African context, but also local communities, Christian communities that pray, small-scale fishers that pray before they go out to sea, because the sea is an extraordinarily dangerous place. And you know, mothers and fathers and children don't know when their families are going to return from the sea because it's very dangerous. And so there are these phenomenal expressions, even undersea sculptures of crosses and so on that we've seen across the world. So it's not just about indigenous peoples and local communities' beliefs of the ocean. We're seeing that as well. And here we have a range of experiences. The woman in the top right section is telling us about how the sea actually makes her feel. She lives in a very impoverished community on the western Cape coast of South Africa, and a small fishing village, very much like the kind of fishing villages that we see here in Italy. And their access to the sea is slowly being eroded, of course, by development and commercial uses of the sea. The small-scale fishers are slowly being pushed out of that livelihood space. But she is expressing a very powerful and passionate account of her particular engagements with the sea and how significant that is for her. So my contribution, I hope, to the discussions today is that the findings, sorry, let me go back. The findings are indicating the emergence of three things which we could potentially explore. The blue consciousness, which I spoke about earlier. This is an epistemology which we're not yet fully exploring, in which we could, from the side of philosophy and potentially international human rights law. Blue rights, which I think is another one. Perhaps I know that there are significant discussions on a blue charter, but I don't know to what extent this has evolved into a notion of blue rights, inalienable fundamental rights to the ocean, and hopefully a utopian view that I hold as an anthropologist is the hope that one day we might have a blue era, which is one that considers the ocean as fundamental, not only to human health, but to the health of all species that have been discovered, and as Lisa indicated, have yet to be discovered, which contribute to the balance of the ecosystem that we have today. So thank you very much to the organizers and partners and to research collaborators. Okay.
So there's time to try to weave together observations or questions for this last address, and then the two others we listened to earlier. If anybody has an observation or question, yes, please.
Well, first of all, thank you, Rose. You're bringing really important dimensions into this conversation. I wondered if in the field work that you have done, and as you look at this sort of deep traditions and this blue consciousness, whether you find any jurisdictions that are doing a good job, or at least are starting to bridge between that reality and the sort of abstract policy regimes that you describe.
Thank you very much. We're not seeing much of this work at present. In fact, certainly in Southern Africa, unfortunately, what we're seeing is a wholesale importation of human rights regimes that have been evolving for the last hundreds of years. This idea of the fundamental human connection with nature, which a lot of local communities are expressing, is not yet codified or perceived. There is the idea of the living heritage, obviously as espoused by UNESCO, and we have many nation states that are signatory to the various conventions of UNESCO, including the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage. But that is still a very generalized discussion of the immaterial connections that humans have with culture. It doesn't talk about this particular relationship between humans and nature, and specifically between humans and the sea. So it's an area that is, I think, ripe for further discussion by international human rights lawyers and ethics specialists and so on.
Rashid, do you want to put your question?
Yeah, so it was Roberto, you made me want to ask a question. Yeah, when you talk about all these new approaches to deal with the carbon, right? And what that may mean. And that made me to start thinking, why are we doing this? We create an issue, a problem, and then we find a solution, which creates another problem. And so how about thinking about what is the root cause of all this push to take more and do more? It's essentially demand. So we are demanding a lot, we the people, right? And this population is the demand from people for things. And so maybe we'll have to start thinking about the root causes and try to deal with it there rather than all this creating new problems as we go. So that was a comment you generated in my head.
Lisa? Okay. Yeah.
Really interesting. Oh, it keeps going off. Okay. What is, in your mind, the best way to give a voice to these ideas, the relationship between the people and the sea, to the decision makers? What is the best way, either at the regional level or a national level or a global level? Do you have ideas?
Thank you, Lisa. I would imagine that allowing, the particular stakeholder groups to actually have the voice at these sort of high-level, meetings where these discussions often take place. But I also feel that perhaps greater exposure to social scientists and people who have been doing, the fundamental kind of field research, to give them the opportunity to articulate some of these positions and terms if local community stakeholders are not able to share that for themselves. But we do know, and you had a line on one of your slides about the Haida peoples in Canada. And I know that they have been extraordinarily active in getting their perspectives across, and I think that other indigenous groups in low-income countries could learn from these indigenous peoples that have actually been quite active and vocal and been able to share their points on a global platform. I think it's about isolation and connectivity, that some of the communities that we have been working with are really just not plugged into these high-level meetings, and they would benefit enormously from sharing their perspectives and their beliefs directly, rather than having an intermediary in the form of an academic.
Yeah, thank you. I know we're running out of time, so I will be really... Now, thank you very much. So thank you for the super inspiring contribution that you gave. I mean, I want to go back to one of the things that you said, is the engagement. I'm one of the people that really like to connect the perception, engagement, then behavior and decision making. So I echo to your question, because I'm probably one of the only people here from the business community. Yeah, the business community is now looking to the change of values of our people, employees, and customers. Sorry to tell it, but because it's changing dramatically, not just in the next generation, but in my generation. I'm a mid-aged dog, and the 65% of people are telling us that they're buying products and services connecting to what is the purpose of the company and the value that they don't just communicate, they live. So how we can use, I don't know if you really are thinking about it, how we can use this effort that companies are, struggling to use, because people are behaving differently and they're trying to cope with this change in behavior. How we can jump on this and use companies and business interests to start to triggering a new, a virtuous cycle on your ideas. It's a large and open question. I don't know if you're ready to think about it.
I will, if may I add, thank you so much for having us here today. In relation to example, practical example to engage more new generation, we just presented as an idea this Disney comic book with Roberto and Ferdinando, and we also have engaged Disney at the worldwide level in order to have in many other languages. That is because comics it's a natural way to attract kids. So this is it's a practical example we are trying in Italy, and we hope Italy is going to be a lead country for the rest of the world to engage kids through comics and Mickey Mouse that is well known. Another example we are thinking with Roberto and Ferdinando is to engage more our churches on Sunday, Conferenza Episcopale in Italy, and with the new president, Cardinal Matteo Zuppi, who is an incredible man. And the idea is it's very simple, is that now we have in the Italian Constitution, Article number 9, integrated more in relation of protection of nature and environment. And the idea to have also a comic book in churches every Sunday, it's a way of expression of kids. Many times are annoyed when they are at church with their parents. No, we have to deal with this. And the idea to have comics and colors that they recognize in their myth, no? Comics that they watch on TV, on smartphones, but these comics are telling the story of nature, the importance of nature, of oceans, and what are practical activities that every day in everyday life we can change to change the world, starting from new generation parents. Thank you.
Thank you for the question and the comment. I think the first one is that there are two sides to it. One is, there's the tricky issue of the commercialization of consciousness, which I think is a tricky thing because it can go either way. It can be used for good, but on the other hand, you also have the potential of it being used for nefarious ends. So we have to be very careful with that one. But one of the things that we certainly observed in our work was the fact that that there is a huge consciousness shift that is happening. It's not just at the level of very visible new generation activists, global activists that are sharing this consciousness, environmental consciousness worldwide, but that there's a locally grounded shift in consciousness that is happening. And interestingly, not among our indigenous peoples that we engaged, but certainly among people that had arrived in South Africa from other parts of the world, that leisure itself has become a form of heritage. So all of these leisure sporting activities where people are kite surfing and swimming and all sorts of business-related leisure activities, which people perceive as only commercializable practices, have in fact become intangible cultural heritage. They become ritualized, consciousness-shifting activities. So there is this, I think we need to, when we are engaging with behavioral change, we need to consider the fact that we have an extremely diverse stakeholder group that we're working with, and not just aim at working with people who we perceive to be indigenous or local, but to consider that even leisure activities that are ostensibly, that appear to be very surface in their, in their possibilities are in fact, could have potential for ritual processes and for heritage processes. And a lot of people were actually claiming, asking for the protection of the oceans, especially in the Southern African context, from mining interest on the basis that they have these health relations, these culturally embedded health relations with the ocean that require protection. So I would be a bit nervous with the commercialization of consciousness thing, but I think that that there is a possibility of looking deeply into the fact that people do have these close relationships.
Roberto, and then we come to you, Martin.
Thanks, Cardinal Turkson. I have a multiple intervention and some answers, hopefully. So, Rashid, the problem is about solutions and problems, that the solutions we look for are those of, led by economic interest, not for the good of, everyone. So the point is that these kind of solutions are increasing, expanding the problem. We create a loop, better technologies for fishing more, and the more we fish, the less fish we have. And in some cases, the industrial fisheries go close to the African coast, and so the local fisheries are part of the culture of some local populations get detrimental effects of that. So the point is, the revolution is turning back to, let's find a solution for improving the health of the environment and the oceans and the quality of our lives. But the point is that who pays for it? Because while we know that the solutions that we currently look for exploit more and more natural resources, so they get an income from this exploitation, we still have to create a business for returning. This was part of my talk. So reverse the perspective of. But I was very much impressed by the presentation by Rose, and I took a note about the long-held trauma in communities with historical oppression that gives to the seas and ocean the possibility to have an important psychological effect, positive effect on populations. And that is very important because I think we all have an innate passion, desire for the wildness, for pristine ecosystems, for a colorful ocean, whatever. And we escape from an artificial and impacted, ecosystems that we are creating around us. The point is that you mentioned, Rose, that a large portion of the population is becoming aware of the importance of nature, and they are have an orientation to protect and to safeguard the nature, and this is fine. But in Italy, for instance, when we look at the marine protected areas, the local populations, in most cases, are against any protection because they feel to be excluded by the protection from the use and the traditional use of the oceans. So this is an important effect because one of the most important obstacles we have for the protection of the marine ecosystems is our cultural heritage, according to which we are used to use the oceans without regulation. We are not conscious that we are causing detrimental effect, and we are aware and scared of the fact that someone else, an authority, is protecting, but also, regulating what has been used for decades. So this requires a socio-economic, feedback, and I'd like to have your opinion.
Copy Rose, before you get to touch, why don't you see whether you can tag on a question from there too? Thanks.
Yes, this is related to what Roberto was saying. The fish sticks that are advertised in our commercials with a captain that feeds on them and there are the children eating them come from South Africa. We have overexploited the Mediterranean and now we are fishing in the Pacific and in the Atlantic and with the industrial power because we have industrial fishing and there you have artisanal fishing. So we are depleting your resources in order to satisfy our need because we destroyed our resources. Is there any awareness of that in African countries?
Thanks for that. Maybe let me start with the second question and then I'll move to Roberto's one. The second one, I think there is certainly awareness of the impact of commercial fishing, external or international commercial fishing, and their impact on artisanal fisheries. In fact, there are a number of complaints about it, but the control of that sector is in the hands of the national government. The national government actually permits, to a large extent, commercial fishing within what are known as territorial waters or the exclusive economic zone. And there is also, as I was discussing with a colleague earlier on, the fact that there's a lot of illegal fishing also that happens on the border of the EEZ with the areas beyond national jurisdiction. So it's extraordinarily difficult to control. And then the third element is, of course, the fact that, like in the case of South Africa, we have a very long coastline and very few resources. So to police even the territorial waters is a very difficult thing. So even if there is illegal fishing that happens within territorial waters, it's not something that is easy to manage. But I think an answer that might perhaps satisfy your question better is the fact that there is some current debate on this idea of a global plantation. The global plantation, in fact, is by the scientist Donna Haraway. She talks about the plantationocene, which is a play on the word the Anthropocene, and she basically describes the globe as this giant plantation where we have the same inequalities that were perpetuated on a very small scale within nations that are now being perpetuated on a global scale, creating these kind of intractable inequalities which have been persisting for the last 500 years or so. That's an area that I think it would be very interesting to look at how these global inequalities are actually playing out, and the fact that there are particular discourses of development that are employed to say, well, we need commercial fishing because it brings income into the country. Fees are actually paid by commercial fishers to the national government. But what Haraway and others are arguing is that it's perpetuating the equivalent of a plantation, but on a global scale, which I think is a very interesting argument. So we are aware of it, but there's quite a few people are quite powerless to engage. So yeah, the second question, can I answer? Very quickly, the second question. There is this tension between the marine protected areas and traditional use of areas that were, not protected under the Marine Protection Act before. The problem is that I think people have taken UNESCO's concept of heritage too seriously. And what I mean by that is that they've imagined it as heritage to be something that is inviolate. In other words, that it is fixed, you can't change it, heritage lasts for all time. Whereas in fact, if you look at historical circumstances, heritage was always something that is extraordinarily dynamic. In other words, people can change their behaviors, they can adapt, and they can make new heritages in order to deal with what is required in the present circumstances.
And Martin, you have, and we'll come to you. Martin, and then we'll come to you.
Rose, thank you very much for bringing in the cultural perspective and touching almost on narratives, which we've been discussing here too. And I wanted to probe or bring to the discussion to you, but also to the audience, a couple of thoughts here. On the other, I mean, you touched on rights, and I think you already mentioned the issue around that. Who is a right holder? What constitutes a right holder? Is it heritage in the sense of many generations, or is somebody who feels passionate about the ocean a share or rights holder? So there's a very rich debate that you touched upon there. And the reason why we're getting into this rights debate is because space is contested. And the question is, who has jurisdiction, maybe legally, but also morally there? So that brings us a little bit back in the dimension of where Laudato Si comes in. I mean, when the Pope looked at the SDG or the 2030 agenda, he says it's an agenda about dignity, about people's dignity, right? So when you take that as a starting point, and it comes together with the UN narrative, leaving nobody behind, it's the same word for the same thing. That means we are one people. It's all about us together rather than you against me. So these rights and access debates are a little bit about power play, and the power plays, for example, in the little video I showed, the indigenous community of the Pacific Islanders, they had zoning rights. There were areas which are called taboo. We would now call them marine protected areas, right? This is not a new concept, it's been around. And what I found fascinating, the leader of the region said, we need to think 7 generations ahead. I wish our leaders would think more than 1 election cycle ahead, right? So there's this time dimension there. But coming back to the narratives, Rose, I really wanted to touch upon you. On the one hand, Lisa spoke about stewardship. So that's very much consistent with the religious cultures that I'm also part of, where we think as the ocean has been sort of, you could almost say, given to us as humans, and we need to take care of it. That's where the stewardship narrative comes into. That doesn't work so well with Asian countries, where when you talk to them about the narrative of the ocean, it's living in harmony with the ocean, which is much more consistent with the One Health approach that we heard about here. That is, you put on equal footing animal health, human health, and planetary health. And so it's a different narrative. The other narrative that we're struggling with, Rose, that you also mentioned, and some of the colleagues here from the private sector also, the sort of intrinsic right of the Mediterranean community, we were thinking of the ocean as an indefinite resource and managing it accordingly. And the easiest way to tell that is in Italy, on land, a farmer has a right to the land, so the land is the value, not the crop. The crop is what you're producing. In the fishery sense, it's handled differently in other cultures. The fish stock has no commercial value. You have no rights on the fish stock. Only when the fish is in the net, it becomes a tradable commodity and of value. That is what got us into the problem, that we're managing it in an economically non-clever way. It's almost by definition unsustainable, just the way we value things. And that brings us back to the share and rights holders and culture issue. That is then, if there is a value of the ocean space as such, who owns it, who can decide about its future, and that's where this rights and culture issue comes in. So I think it's a very rich debate around that, and I'm not gonna untangle all of that, but I think the one word, Rose, that I wanted you to react upon, in the spirit of the decade, in the spirit of 2030 agenda, this word of co-design, co-creation, and co-production comes in a lot. And I think it's one of the ways of scientifically, technically saying, you know, engage with all the share and rights holders if you're thinking about a solution or an exploitation or something like that. And if that was done, probably we would have less conflict, but it's typically not done, and that's where we have the conflict. But I really wanted you to react on this rights holder perspective through the co-creation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Martin. I think it's really important to tease out the different elements, and I think you've done that very, very eloquently. I think the point, one of the things that we pick up, obviously not just in the sort of scholarship on human rights and some of the thoughts that I've been trying to generate around this notion of blue rights, is that there are particular proprietary discourses that are at play. You know, who owns it? Who controls it? who has power over it, and where are these circuits of knowledge? We call them circuits of knowledge. Where do they reside? Where do they land? And who's circulating them? And I think that's very important, because in the communities where we have been working, where the small team that I've been working, where they have been doing research, we have noticed a kind of what we call transcendent, philosophy that is at play. That humans do not have the right to decide, what lives and what doesn't live, what should be exploited and what should not be exploited. That it's not just the species, the marine species, but also the material nature of nature itself that has a form of consciousness. So it's like a real mind-bending kind of thinking for us who are used to this notion of stewardship, that humans have the philosophical control over nature and have, are the ones that are supposed to ensure its survival to the very end of time. And so very, very briefly then, I think that we need to excavate these proprietary discourses if we want to do the scholarship on this. And then secondly, to pursue the idea of co-design, co-protection, co-creation in formulating this blue charter or blue rights. Because we will have to bring together these different consciousnesses and philosophies in order to distill something that is amenable to all.
You can do a very quick one for us.
A very quick question. With respect to offshore renewable energies in the African context, so far African countries did not tap much into that sort of technology. You see the cultural heritage, as you expressed it in your perfect presentation, endangered by this new sort of technologies?
Thanks for that. I can answer that very quickly so everyone is not kept from their tea. So what is happening, especially in the Southern African context, is that there is now legal precedence for the inclusion of cultural heritage in impact assessments. So previously, it was just the EIAs, your environmental impact assessments, that were required by national governments. And we are seeing more and more, the oil companies and oil and gas companies turning to cultural specialists to carry out cultural heritage impact assessments and social impact assessments to understand human relations with the sea, and also how to, I don't know, it's very tricky, but how to mitigate some of the impacts, whether these are what they call normal operations impacts, exploration, seismic exploration survey, and so on, as well as the actual, drilling and extraction. So, and if there were to be what they call upset conditions, which are, your blowouts and so on. So they're actually calling upon cultural specialists to do these very detailed cultural heritage impact assessments and to investigate, human relations with the sea and how to factor those in. I did come across a fascinating piece from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they had set up something fascinating, which is not to look at potential impacts, but to mitigate at least 5 to 10 years ahead. So in the event that there was even a minor spillage or whether it was a blowout, they would have to have specific insurances and mechanisms in place to protect communities for at least 5 to 10 years. And that was not happening in Southern Africa yet. So it's something that I'm hoping to.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you all of you speakers, Elisa, Martin, and who've interviewed. So it's now a small coffee break, and coffee break is on this side of the hall, so you can go through there or through there, and the coffee is, is on that side, and we'll come back together at 11:45 for the second session. Thank you.